Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim, Resident Fellow with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here today with Michael Horn, Senior Partner with Entangled Solutions, Distinguished Fellow and co-founder of the Christensen Institute, and a member of the faculty for our Executive Leadership Academy. Michael, it's great to have you here on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again.
So tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing with Entangled Solutions and how you got to that point, working with Entangled and working with your clients, particularly in the education space.
Yeah, so the basic idea when Paul Friedman, the founder of Entangled, started it was that education right now is at this particular moment in time where we've moved from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy in all of society. And yet the majority of our education institutions were founded during that industrial era. And therefore, they're finely tuned for that economy, but not for the knowledge economy today. And as a result, if you want to transform that, you really need an ecosystem approach that is able to be flexible and use a variety of tools to help usher in the future of that education system to support all learners in the knowledge economy. And so Entangled Solutions itself within the larger Entangled group serves as a consultancy to help institutions innovate into that world. We help with sustaining and disruptive innovations. The Entangled Group more broadly is incubating both for-profit and not-for-profit entities that help fill gaps in the ecosystem that would be critical movers. Just to give one example, we've incubated a company called PathStream that works with companies like Salesforce, Tableau, Unity, Facebook, and the like, basically platform companies that to do digital marketing today, you need to know how to do marketing in Facebook. And so they basically create whole curriculum for these companies and then help serve students to help them get mastery-based certificates, but also credit for community colleges and the like. Very neat company that's really helping a lot of students level up their skill set so that they can be qualified for entry-level jobs. So those are the sorts of things that we create to help people usher into the knowledge economy.
So tell us more about this intersection of disruptive innovation and the knowledge economy. You just mentioned how schools today were built to serve a certain purpose during the Industrial Revolution, but now we're going through this new revolution into the knowledge era. What do you mean by that? And when you talk about disruptive innovation, what exactly does that look like?
Yeah, sure. So, a lot of jobs were on the factory line for lots of workers decades and decades ago. And really the purpose of schooling was to figure out who you could sort into the higher tiers to graduate from high school, to go into college. Most individuals did not have any of those experiences, in fact. And that was actually a design of the system. It wasn't a flaw of the system. We've now realized as we enter the knowledge economy where people, the vast majority of whom are using their brains for knowledge-based work, right, to do a variety of critical thinking, communication, computational thinking, creativity, and so forth to bring to bear in their jobs, they need a much higher skill set that frankly is changing so fast given technology right now that the half-life of skills is now roughly 5 years in our economy. And so we need a system that is much more nimble, isn't built upon sorting people out, but is built upon helping every single individual master the knowledge and skills they need to up-level in their lives to be able to lead successful and happy, fulfilling lives. And so that's a very different rhythm and of the jobs. It's also a very different rhythm you need of the education institutions and a very different mindset and ethos about not letting anyone fall through the cracks, but being able to serve all successfully and allow every single one to fulfill their human potential. Now, the disruptive innovation part of it and how that plays into it, disruptive innovation is this force that takes things that are expensive and inaccessible and deeply centralized and therefore can only serve a limited few, and decentralizes that world to serve many, many more people with more affordable, accessible, simple, and so forth things. And I think it's very applicable in higher education in specific right now because you have millions of adults, for example, who can't access higher education to be able to upskill in their lives. They need more affordable, more accessible, more convenient options that can serve them where they are, while maybe they have a family and are working, for example. You think about individuals who are trying to afford college today, and given the skyrocketing price of college for many individuals, it is increasingly leaving millions out. And those who are taking on debt are saying, I don't know if this is a good idea, given what I can see and what's the actual return on this investment and so forth. And so I think disruptive innovation plays a critical role in helping create new options that better serve learners in these more flexible ways.
And let's take that to the school or school system level. Like you've been working with our Executive Leadership Academy the past 2 days on this idea of looking at innovation in the K-12 space, whether you're a school leader, a system level leader. Tell us a little bit more about this idea of when you have a certain level of certainty over a possible idea, project, a policy. There's a certain way to think about it in a structured way to get to a certain outcome. But more often than not, as we're faced with this new era, there is a lot more uncertainty about what program, what sort of curriculum, what methods might be useful to help students achieve at their classes and their academics, what have you. Tell us a little bit more about what school leaders can do to navigate this idea of disruptive innovation, and while both maintaining what's working well and trying out new ideas.
Yeah, so the basic premise is you laid it out well. For an idea that you have certainty around, you have a lot of confidence it's going to work as you've sort of written it out on the paper or the whiteboard or whatever else when you want to implement it. Typically what we do is you sort of in the background make a bunch of assumptions that you have pretty high confidence are right. You look at the outcomes that are likely to happen from implementing this new project or initiative or whatever you might call it, and if that looks attractive to you as a school leader, you go ahead and give the green light and you go ahead and enact it to try to accomplish some sort of goal. The challenge is if you are working in an area that's deeply unfamiliar, as you said, where you have considerable uncertainty, that same process is likely to see you spend a lot of money on an idea that hasn't been vetted and tested, and oftentimes burn a lot of capital, both political and real dollars, on an idea and sort of have a spectacular failure and not be able to have enough left over of either to adjust. And so in those circumstances, we recommend a process called discovery-driven planning, something that Rita McGrath at Columbia created and coined this notion of. And basically it says, let's flip the script and start with what outcomes have to occur for this idea to be a promising one that you would invest in. Let's all name them at the front. And then take your plan and those outcomes and say, what are all the assumptions that you are making that have to prove true for you to hit those outcomes? And then the big idea is once you've done that huge list of assumptions, and we're talking 50, 100, 150 assumptions, you figure out tests for each of those to very quickly and cheaply test those assumptions to figure out if the most critical ones you're just wrong about. The world doesn't work this way, and therefore this idea is not a good one, or you need to adjust it in some way before you go about just implementing, assuming you were right. And then that gives you the ability to pivot as you're testing and learning about the world. You can change your idea, you can adjust it, or maybe you say, you know what, we thought it looked great on paper, but when we're testing it in the real world, these different assumptions just aren't holding up, and let's save ourselves all the time and embarrassment and not go about it. You basically want fast failure so that you avoid that spectacular failure.
And this connects to some of the work from one of our other faculty members, Matt Candler, founder of 4.0 Schools. And in his work with our Teacher Leader Academy, he talks about this idea of dividing by 10. So for instance, you might have a system level leader that wants to try out this big new program or idea district-wide, but you could roll it out, and without testing these assumptions, it could be a spectacular failure in the sense that it might not have an effect or the outcome that you wanted, or it might even lead to unintended harm on students. And this idea of figuring out what your assumptions are with this program, for instance, and then dividing by 10 in the sense that you go from a district level to like a school level, and then from a school level to a grade level, to a classroom level, to piloting something with a couple students, starting small and then working your way back up.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I'll give you a very concrete example of how this played out poorly in another circumstance. I'll use a higher ed example so I don't throw any K-12 educators under the bus. But, in California many years ago when MOOCs were becoming a thing, massive open online courses, Sebastian Thrun and Udacity had developed one of the larger MOOC companies at that time. And Jerry Brown, then the governor of California, got super excited about this. And with like blazing banners and press releases and so forth, they had this big announcement where they were going to use Udacity to essentially solve the community college crisis and give everyone access to the courses that they needed, and the overcrowding would be resolved in California, and yada, yada, yada. Fast forward 2 years later, it crashed and burned and didn't work. And, I kind of think before you had made the big press release and spent a lot of money on this initiative and a lot of the political capital that Governor Brown brought to bear and so forth, yeah, you might have wanted to test that out maybe with just a few students first. So that divide by 10 thing, I think, makes a lot of sense. And I think what's different about sort of what Matt and I are talking about compared to some of the other stuff that's out there is we're not just saying lean startup, like throw a bunch of stuff at the wall, test and learn as quick as possible. That assumption-driven process of being very controlled experiments before you just jump in is a way to de-risk the process so that when you're experimenting, you're not experimenting in a reckless way with students.
When you mentioned the example from California and just opening up these MOOCs, right? What may have been some of the assumptions that should have been tested early on?
Yeah, I mean, one is that the students that they were trying to serve had the technology at home, the broadband, for example, to even be able to fire it up. Did they have the computers to be able to do this? Did they have the time to be able to do these self-paced courses? Did they have the academic background knowledge to be able to access the material at the level that it was doing? On and on and on, right? And I think you would have reached a very different conclusion very quickly that, it turned out that a lot of these students didn't have broadband access at home. That was a very basic thing that you could have tested just by calling up 3 students and asking them that were in your your target demographic just to figure it out, right? And so little tests like that and of careful consideration of the assumptions would have spared you a lot. And by the way, maybe you would have out of that said, this is still a promising idea, but let's change the plan. We're going to have it, we're going to pay for broadband access for this population of students, for example, or we're going to base it out of libraries in all the communities across California, for example. Or, this idea of self-paced courses, no teachers, that's not really going to work, but we're going to actually create a staffing model where you can actually have maybe a coach for every single individual. I have no idea what would have come out of there, but a very different design from the one that started.
Mm-hmm. And right there is an example of a program that, if those who were implementing it had tested some of these assumptions early on, then the sustainability of that and implementation could have followed through.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, ultimately, you want to connect it to the sustainability, and that's what we're talking with the school leaders here right now. Is your assumptions shouldn't just be around does my program work or not, but is it sustainable? Does it have a financial model that I know can persist even in the face of budget cuts that I'm sure will be at some point on the horizon and things like that.
On the topic of higher education, I want to switch gears just a little bit here in closing and chat a little bit about your new book that you have out with Bob Moesta, Choosing College, How to Make Better Learning Decisions Throughout Your Life. And earlier when you were chatting a bit with us about the book, you mentioned how the title is a bit misleading. It's not exactly about choosing college, but about decision making with these big moments in our lives. So tell us a little bit more about the book, how you and Bob came about with what you've published, and tell us a little bit about those high-level takeaways on the whys that students might be asking themselves about these big decisions.
Yeah, so I the big premise for the book was that our college system is not graduating nearly the percentage of students that it should. Even those that it graduates arguably are not prepared for the workforce into which they're entering. And so there's a lot of substandard outcomes in all of this. And it's really expensive at the same time. Costs keep going up year over year over year. And one of our hypotheses for why this is that students are coming with a range of motivations and purposes and circumstances to these institutions. And the institutions are trying to be one-size-fits-all places. And in an effort to be that, they're actually suboptimal for all those students. And the overhead administrative cost of trying to serve all those students is significant. And so that's driving up costs, creating poor outcomes. And if colleges had a better sense of why people were coming to them, they could tailor and design accordingly. So we took this jobs to be done theory and started to create mini documentaries of over a couple hundred students in their decision-making process around not just college, to your point, but any learning that occurs after post-secondary education. So we've got online courses in there. We've got boot camps, age 17 to age 60 and so forth. What came out of it was so compelling that the whys behind the educational choices that individuals were making were just not what we expected, A. And B, the stories themselves were so compelling that we felt like, gosh, we have to write a book that helps parents and students make better choices by understanding where they are right now, their current circumstances, and understand the set of options that are appropriate for them, and then broaden the set of options that could serve them well. And then the second half of the book still addresses the colleges and universities to help them design better experiences to serve these students better. Now, the 5 whys that we found out, and this is the other takeaway, is like we spend so much energy in this country obsessing over which college am I going to apply to and how do I get in and rankings and varsity blues to cheat my way in and all this stuff, right? And we never step back to ask, why are you going? And what's that more foundational question? What's your purpose? This is what this book is consumed with. And so, when we looked at students' actual purposes, we had guessed they would be things around get me a job, get me a career, switch jobs, transition to adulthood, things like that. That's our language. That's not their language, and it's not their reality. Their 5 whys, if you will, that we discovered. One we call help me get into my best school. So it's all about the act of getting into the best as they defined it for them. The second we found was help me do what's expected of me. So these were students who were going to satisfy someone else's expectations of them, but they were not particularly excited about the experience and they were incredibly apathetic about it. Not a good reason to go to a 4-year college is the spoiler alert. The third was help me get away. So these were students who were running from something, but not necessarily towards something. Again, 4-year college was not a good fit for this. The fourth one we found was help me step it up. So these were students who looked at their lives and said, something's not good, I'm running from it, but I know what I'm driving toward. This isn't who I am and I can be better and I know how to get there and I'm going to step it up. Good reason to go to school. And then the last one we found was help me extend myself. So these were typically, actually all of them in our population were adult learners who were able to make the time and budget and say, I've always wanted to do something or challenge myself or learn more in this way. And now I have the time and money that I'm going to go do that. And if it doesn't work out for me, it's okay because I'm like, life is okay as is. And you think about serving those different jobs, how you design yourself is incredibly different. And the choices you make as a parent and a student are incredibly different depending on where you are in those.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that overview of choosing college, and perhaps next you and Bob might work on a book or something else about looking at the implications of these whys, these questions that students ask themselves, what the implications might be for K-12 and for K-12
honestly,
administrators.
That's honestly the big missing piece of the book in retrospect, and it occurred to me about 3 months before publication, by which time it's too late to do anything about it, but that there's a whole set of implications for how high schools and middle schools, arguably even elementary schools, need to do a better job of helping students build passions, understand who they are, what they like and don't like, what gives them energy, what drains energy from them, and how they can contribute. And I think that's a whole high school redesign set of opportunities that's really exciting out of this. I hope not just us contributes to this, but other people have clever ideas after they read the book.
Certainly, it's opportunities for disruptive innovation in that space as well. So, Michael, thanks so much for making time to join us on our podcast and for being with our Leadership Institute participants. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me again.